Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Zoe Evans, and I manage the Less Lawn, More Life campaign. This is the 7th webinar in our challenge series, and Lorraine Johnson is here to share her wisdom on how to navigate difficult conversations with neighbors and HOAs. So before we bring Lorraine on, let me give you some housekeeping and a quick rundown of what we're covering. So this webinar is hosted on YouTube, so don't forget to press that like button if you enjoy this video, and be sure to subscribe for our channel for more great content. You can pause and rewind if you miss anything, so that's easy. We're going to share links for mentioned resources in the chat throughout the live webinar. And we encourage you to use the chat and comments to ask questions and engage with each other. We love that. So here's the plan. I'm going to give a quick overview of what the Less Lawn, More Life challenge is for anyone who's new or just joining, and then I'll hand it over to Lorraine for the main event, and we'll close with a Q&A. So briefly, for those who don't know yet, Less Lawn, More Life is a free 12-week challenge. Each week, we send you a small, doable action into your email inbox, and these actions add up to real ecological change on your piece of earth or balcony or whatever you have agency over. You get expert speakers like the one you're going to hear from today. You get a free yard assessment, and then there are prizes and badges at the end. So some of you are deep into it already. We're going to be ending very soon, but some of you might be starting week 1 today or tomorrow, and that's totally fine. So you can join anytime at lesslawnmorelife.com, and you'll start from the beginning. The important thing is just that wilder is healthier for you, your kids, your pets, and that's what this is all about. This would not be possible without the amazing organizations that are behind Less Lawn, More Life, including Wild Ones, who's co-hosting today's presentation with us. These are some of our key strategic partners who provide the expertise and free resources that make this free campaign possible. And Wild Ones in particular is very integrated. Every week you have there's a button in the email that says submit a question, and you can ask a question of experts, and that goes to Wild Ones, and they help answer these questions. So thank you so much for Wild Ones. And if you're not already a member of a local chapter, you should be sure to look it up. It's an incredible way to get on the ground local help, seed swaps, and expertise. But those are not all of our partners. We have now over 200 partners. So this is truly a grassroots campaign and movement. So if you know a local organization or maybe your HOA that should be part of this, please encourage them to join and help promote this campaign in your community. So all of the webinars of the challenge series are available to watch by recording. After today's session, we have just one final webinar as part of Less Lawn, More Life, and we're going to be doing that in August, and I'll actually be co-teaching that with my mother and the author of the Design Your Wild Substack. If you're signed up for the challenge, you'll be invited to all of these. They're all free, and you'll get the recordings. And in addition to the expert webinars, you also have access to our free companion app called Wilder Places, which supports you in the challenge and beyond. So you can download it on your Apple device or Android, put in your address, and you're going to get personalized native plant recommendation based on what's actually native to where you live, and that's ranked by how much they support pollinators and the food web. And you can also now follow the public places of friends, neighbors, and movement leaders to see what they're planting and get inspiration for your own projects. And there are lots more features in the works. This is truly built by and for the community, so your feedback, your input is what drives our roadmap. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to our guest today. Lorraine Johnson is based in Toronto and has been writing about native plants and the environment for decades. And she's the author of 14 books, from Grow Wild to her latest, A Northern Gardener's Guide to Native Plants and Pollinators. A lot of Lorraine's work is about the social side of gardening. So how to talk to a neighbor who doesn't get it yet, how to handle an HOA complaint or a bylaw challenge, how to get a community on board with an ecological garden. She writes about it with humor and a bit of provocation. She's a former honorary director of Wild Ones and past president of the North American Native Plant Society, and I'm so excited for her talk. And make sure to stay tuned for the Q&A where we'll cover some common questions on this topic. So Lorraine, thank you for being here. Let's dive right in.
It's such an honor to be here as a part of Less Lawn, More Life. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's such an honor to be a part of this series and this project. So today I'm going to be talking about three connected aspects of the topic. I'm going to share some ideas about how to talk about your own individual garden with your own neighbors and homeowners associations or HOAs and municipal officials. I'm going to be talking about collective action as well, kind of trying to move the needle on cultural norms and traditions around gardening. And I'll also be talking about structural change. Like if we're trying to talk to neighbors and HOAs about our gardens, if we feel we need to defend them, maybe it's time for some policy changes and which involves political actions. So I want to also stress right at the beginning that there's no one size that fits all in this stuff. There's so many different approaches that are possible. There's no right way, no wrong way to speak with your neighbors about this or to HOAs and municipalities. So I'm going to be offering a bunch of different possibilities. Uh, as Zoe said, and thanks so much for that introduction, Zoe. A few words about how I came to this topic, actually. So I'm based in Toronto, and I came to gardening kind of around environmental issues when I started writing books about environmental issues. Um, my first book on was very like regional. My first book on native plant gardening, the Ontario Naturalized Garden. So it was very um, regional, and it was published in 1995. Um, and as soon as I started writing about it, I started hearing from people who were running into problems with their neighbors, with their homeowners associations, with their municipalities. So, although there have been lots of very positive changes in the last 30 plus years, right from the start, I realized that social acceptance of a way of gardening that maybe isn't the dominant way of gardening or the kind of traditional way of gardening, it can be challenging. And kind of sometimes talking to neighbors about this can be challenging. For example, with my own first native plant garden, I loved it. I was so happy to be doing it. And my neighbor's response was, "It's a jungle. Why don't you cut it?" So I got involved because I was hearing from so many people who were having trouble. I got involved in advocacy around these municipal codes and reforming them and helping people in their own cases. And I started to see a lot of similarities. I also got involved in court cases. And here in Canada, anyway, we had a seminal court case, Sandy Bell, and it was in the early 90s. She was charged for this garden. And she fought back in the courts, and it led to a decision. And this is specific to Canada, so I know it's not a help for in the U.S., but it shows what's possible. The decision was that Sandy had a constitutional right to her natural garden, her naturalized garden, and that the bylaw in the city she was in, which was Toronto, where I also am, that the bylaw here, so the ordinance basically, was um, unconstitutional, void for vagueness. And the terms in the Toronto bylaw were ones that are used in bylaws and ordinances across and in HOA rules across the continent. So um, my activism and advocacy around this issue grew as I researched and wrote these two books. And um, I had the honor and pleasure of spending time interviewing and writing about Laurie Otto, who was one of the inspirations for Wild Ones and was a trailblazer in this area of fighting against outdated uh, municipal ordinances. She defended her garden in the Midwest, in Milwaukee, and I also had the pleasure of meeting and working with and spending a lot of time with Brett Rappaport, who is also a trailblazing lawyer working on these issues. In '93, he wrote what is still a very important legal analysis of municipal codes and ordinances and HOA rules. So if you're interested in any of these writings, these kind of more historical things, or cases that I'm working on now, or people helping, or just kind of the broader context of this stuff, there's lots of stuff on my website, links to my writing there. I'm still writing books about native plants, and I've, as I said, witnessed a lot of changes. 30 years ago, I found people were afraid of pollinators, and now, a lot of people are on board with attracting pollinators through planting native plants. So there has been some positive change, but maybe not as much or as fast as we need, considering the state of biodiversity and climate change. So last summer, and again, this is a Canadian resource, but I think there are lots of links here um, that will be relevant across North America. So last year, I was one of the co-founders of a national campaign on bylaw or municipal ordinance reform. And it is linked on my blog, which is on my website, and there are loads of resources in this campaign that can help you. So, one, uh, 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 you know, the challenge obviously is to ramp up this activity because of these intersecting crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. So it's crucial to bring our neighbors on board, not only so that, they aren't complaining about what we're doing, and bring our HOAs on board and our municipalities. So not only so that we don't have to deal with complaints, but also so that they might consider actually starting their own native plant gardens and their own wilder landscapes, so that we can, really address the challenges that are ahead. And that we're in the midst of with climate change and biodiversity loss. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways that I've found have worked over the 30 plus years of doing this work, of, talking to people and doing presentations and writing about native plant gardens and that sort of thing. Oh, what I do want to just say as well, that photo on the right, that's actually from the city of Toronto, the city where, 30 years ago that they were taking Sandy Bell to court and the city lost. And now, so much movement. There are billboards on bus shelters urging people to grow native plants in this community. So that's amazing. But one of the things I've observed over these decades, and I still find it's the case, is that a lot of people out there in the general public and in gardeners think that native plants are weeds. I do so many presentations every year on native plant gardening, all over the place, and often to gardening groups. And one of the first things I ask people is, "Hey, what's the first thing you think of when I say the word native plants?" And the response that comes back is weeds. So we have to acknowledge and think about the fact that when we're trying to figure out how to talk to our neighbors and homeowners associations and municipal officials, there's an idea out there very entrenched that native plants are weeds, and we really need to address that. And I've got some tips and techniques for that. There's an idea out there that all native plant gardens are messy or look messy and uncared for. And I have to admit that I feel somewhat implicated in that kind of myth and misconception out there, because, you look at the title of one of my books, Grow Wild, this idea that, it kind of slightly, that word, people are nervous about that word and sometimes think, wait, I want a garden that looks like a more conventional garden. Oh, so I can't, quote, use or plant native plants. And that couldn't be further from the truth. You can plant, in whatever style appeals. So, but that idea is out there that native plant gardens are always messy. There's an idea out there that native plant gardens will be overrun by rodents, mosquitoes, and ticks. So we need to really understand that when we're talking to neighbors, these really, and homeowners associations and municipal officials, if we are speaking with them, that they might have these ideas because they're very common ideas. Um, And I just want to say on ticks, because I've observed this coming up more and more lately, that Homegrown National Park has some amazing resources on that and ways to talk with people about ticks, the science of ticks. I won't go into it in detail, but I will say that the main thing to remember, I think, when talking to neighbors, or if they're putting up challenges to you, like, wait, what about ticks, rodents, pests, and that sort of thing, the principle to remember and to mention: biodiversity is protective, whether we're talking about ticks, climate change, pest problems, and without you don't even have to go deep into the science of that and have to worry about explaining that to people. Biodiversity is protective. Um, One of the other things that I think we're up against, that I've observed over and over again in speaking with neighbors, is that there's a real kind of disconnect out there um, around nature, a fear of nature in some cases, a desire to control and overcome nature. I think the evidence of that can be seen all over. So, those of us who are creating these gardens that make a place for nature, um, we need to remember that for some of our neighbors, HOAs, our gardens can lead to a bit of discomfort among them. It makes them feel uncomfortable. So if we keep that in mind in our discussions, it can really help. Another thing, unfortunately, we have to keep in mind is that there's increasing polarization, especially around kind of, I would say I've seen that lawns in some way have become a little bit of a front line in the culture wars, through these kind of opposing, um, polarized opinions, as you can see from these screenshots of some recent articles. Um, and, I think it's important when speaking with neighbors and HOAs to remember that for a lot of people, a manicured lawn is their ideal of beauty. So, while, I personally agree with the idea that a lawn is, very much connected with colonialism. I think it's a landscape type that's basically on chemical life support and all of those things. I, I, I believe them. I feel they're true. But at the same time, when speaking with neighbors about wilder landscapes, native plant gardens, that sort of thing, I really don't lead with a polarized position like that. And I don't sugarcoat the history or deny the ecological damages of the lawn. I just don't necessarily lead with that kind of polarization. Kind of feel them out. Start with an understanding that for a lot of people, and the needle we're trying to move, in the kind of gardening norms, is the idea we're trying to really make inroads on the idea that, um, native plant gardens, we want to spread the message that they can be beautiful, but a lot of people just really, really love lawns. We need to keep that in mind. We also I think the problem isn't just the brand's social messaging and conventional gardening messages, and about how the lawn is kind of the most appropriate response, for the general public out there, to the most appropriate response to bare earth. That idea is out there. Um, it's also, we need to recognize that because that kind of primacy of the lawn is so entrenched and is propped up with these coercive municipal codes and HOA rules, um, that people can be really, including our neighbors, can be really worried and frightened about doing something a little bit different, about starting a native plant garden, or naturalized landscape, and they're worried about the ramifications of maybe having to defend their garden to the HOA. So if we keep all this in mind, I think it will make for better conversations. And I want to acknowledge the really important work of Professor Joan Nassauer of the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. She's done some, if you want to do a deeper dive into some of these resources, she's done a lot of work on, and research and scholarship on, kind of attitudes to landscapes, and how, and in particular, how people respond to landscapes that might look wilder than conventional gardening kind of presents as the ideal. And one of the things her research has shown is that the kind of obvious uniform neighborhood norms really dramatically influence people into, make people want to match or lead to people wanting to match those norms in their own front yards. And really, that's just kind of a fancy way of saying, people want to belong. And what that says to me is that's kind of added motivation to really encourage filling our neighborhoods with habitat gardens and pollinator gardens everywhere. Um, but it's also something to keep in mind. And one of the things that Joan Nassauer has written a lot about and done research on as part of this is the importance of what she calls cues to care. So, if we have what Professor Nassauer what her research is showing is that if landscape elements are immediately recognizable as designed, or they're these signals of caring human intention or consistency with local cultural traditions or social norms of what landscapes look like, then what her research has shown is that folks are more likely to kind of feel comfortable with something that kind of pushes the boundaries. So if we keep this in mind, it helps in those conversations. But we also need to keep in mind that the cues to care don't necessarily guarantee that neighbors, HOAs, and municipalities will be on board with what we're doing in those conversations. This is someone I was helping out a garden, and you can see it looks pretty conventional in the sense on the left, like a traditional garden bed, really, but with native plants. And the trouble that she had with her fighting to defend her garden at City Hall. And we went together for a couple of meetings at City Hall, and lo and behold, the same plants that were in her garden were at City Hall. So the ironies in this stuff can abound. But just to remember that those cues to care don't necessarily mean that neighbors will understand, but they might lessen the chances of kind of hard conversations or that kind of thing. Um, so some of the possible cues to care, I mean, there's so much out there about in the native plant gardening literature. There's so many resources around designing with native plants to show intentionality. Wild Ones has resources. Homegrown National Park has resources. They're really out there. If you Google design and native plant gardening, you'll get lots of resources. But I really like this handy infographic that my friend Janet Mackey did for the Hamilton Master Gardeners, which basically talks about some possible cues to care to signal intentions: seating areas, sculptures, design repetition, buffer zones, signage, design for all season interest, pathways, that kind of thing. I would also just like to kind of highlight that the notion of these cues to care um, uh, i- as a way to kind of acknowledge gardening conventions and conform your space to those gardening conventions in order to lessen the chance of hard conversations or challenges to what you're doing. Um, these aren't necessarily challenging the cultural norms around gardening when you conform. So ask yourself, I think each of us will have a different answer. And wherever you land on this question is for you to decide. But when we think of landscapes that can be, native plant gardens that can be quite wild looking, we can ask ourselves, do we want to challenge these cultural norms around gardening? Or do we want to conform to them to the degree necessary for good neighbor relationships and to avoid all the trouble that hassle that challenges can be? So to what degree are we able or willing to make changes to the aesthetics of our garden in order to try to make to mitigate trouble or not have trouble in the first place. And I think that's kind of at the heart of a lot of this stuff, that question. And each of us, as I said, will answer it on our own. Signage, although I would say I think a lot of us who are deep in the native plant movement and already have native plant gardens and are working for change are very interested in really pushing back against some of the cultural norms and changing the conversation around, the value of a wilder looking landscape. Signage is a great way for letting neighbors and communities and municipalities know what you're doing and why. It signals intention. So I know sometimes it's hard to actually have conversations with neighbors, but signage is a kind of conversation. Put up signs, let people know what you're doing. It's also an opportunity for creativity. Whether you make your own sign or go the step of getting certified by an organization. You know what? Sometimes even just adding plant labels is a kind of way to signal intention. I have a friend who added Latin plant tags that he got, basically they were left over from a nursery. So they didn't even match his plants. So they weren't great public education. But he observed that putting those Latin plant tags in front of plants helped people understand that he was intentionally gardening and somehow added a degree of credibility or something among some of the neighbors. I think what's really important is that along with these design ideas and design tweaks that we have the choice of adopting if we want to go that route. It's really important in speaking with neighbors or homeowners associations or municipal officials in navigating these conversations, starting in a good way by listening and asking questions and finding out if they have concerns and what those concerns might be. It's really valuable, and to listen with respect. And again, I stress those cultural messages that we've all heard and that the public is steeped in around gardening. Those messages are different from many aspects of native plant gardening. So allow some understanding for where your neighbor is coming from, and listen to them. I've observed in these decades, a lot of the concerns recur, and municipalities and HOAs and neighbors, they don't want abandonment or neglect. They're worried about property values. They're worried about your plants moving into their yard. They're worried about conformity and the neighborhood look. They're maybe even worried about an implied rejection of their aesthetics and values. So keep that in mind and really listen, and take time to consider what where they're coming from. So important. What I often find, though, and what I mentioned at the beginning, is that a whole lot of people think native plants are weeds. So it's also a great place to start a conversation. And again, there's no right way to do this or wrong way. This might not be a conversation that you want to have with your neighbors, but it's one that I've found pretty fruitful. Like, what do they think weeds are? What are they worried about with weeds? A lot of people, as I said, think native plants are weeds, but also aren't really sure about the origin of some of the non-native plants that are that they consider weeds, and they think those are native plants. So there's just so much room for good, deep, honest conversations about that. And in the context of ordinances and homeowners association rules that prohibit weeds, part of the problem is that so often they just say vaguely, you can't have weeds, and they don't define them. So your neighbors are probably uncertain about, especially if they're not gardeners, about, what what are considered weeds, and they're uncertain, and they're probably, you know, um, they don't know if they start a garden, will they be subjected to some kind of sanction or whatever. So you could have a big philosophical conversation with them, but you could also, what I've found really useful is actually to talk with them about milkweed, because folks used to really consider milkweed a weed. That was one of the quote unquote weeds that, gardeners would respond with when I said, "What do you think of when I say native plants?" And they'd say weeds. And I'd ask, "What are some of the weeds that cause you problems?" And they'd say milkweed 30 years ago. And in fact, when I wrote that first book, The Ontario Naturalized Garden, it was actually illegal to grow milkweed in Ontario. So that's changed. But so the context of this, but ideas about milkweed have changed enormously. We've all witnessed this. I would say the general public is so on board with the idea of monarchs and milkweeds, the relationship between a native plant and this native insect and why it's so important. So if we, if we talk with people about and use that specialist co-evolved relationship between a native plant and an, charismatic insect as a jumping off point to actually talk with our neighbors about the fact that that co-evolved specialist relationship is not really unique. That, all the butterflies, all the moths in the US, all of the, they all have these co-evolved relationships with particular native plants that are host plants for them that they depend on. And so we can start there with monarchs, we can move to other butterflies and moths, but we can even go further, not just the birds and the bees, but all the species we don't even know about. These co-evolved relationships are the way the world works. And then we could even get into conversations about, the responsibility that we might have as humans to care for all of the biodiversity of these species and those relationships with native plants. And one of the ways we can express that care is through our gardens, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing this native plant gardening, and that we want to be good relatives to the other species that we share the earth with. And of course, this notion of being a good relative is something I have learned from Indigenous teachers and elders and knowledge holders. And I've found that in this time of reckoning with history, I've found that folks, friends, neighbors who maybe are new to the idea of native plant gardening, it really resonates with them when we talk about it in the context of being good stewards of the earth and that being a human responsibility, and also, to reckon with a history of native plants and native peoples being removed from the land. So I find that these co-evolved relationships really help. And even getting into specifics of that, if you want to go deep, if that's a way that's going to work for you with your neighbors, like just giving people an idea, talking about the complexity and the extent of these specialist relationships. Like the general public is kind of at monarchs and milkweed. And then you might have neighbors who are saying, "Whoa, look, you're letting flea," and you might even have native plant gardener friends saying, "Wait, why are you allowing fleabane to grow? It's a native plant, sure, but isn't it a weed?" And you can talk about, for example, this flower moth for whom fleabane is the only known larval host plant. Or you can talk about all of the other specialist relationships with the pollen specialist bees. This is and moths. This is a list from the book I co-wrote with Sheila Kola, Northern Gardener's Guide to Native Plants and Pollinators. And we profile about, 320, 350, something like that, native plants. It's for the Northeast and the Great Lakes area. So that list here is for that area. But for each of the plants we profile, we include the specialist relationships for each plant. And I've found that maybe not everyone, but those who are kind of, I don't know, interested in, they've heard about monarchs, they know about milkweed, and that their interest has been piqued. It really helps to kind of open their eyes to the wonder of the world of these co-evolved relationships and the extent of them, how many there are. Okay, goldenrod is a classic example in that I actually I suspect that about, you know, almost all, well, let's say 50% of the conflicts between neighbors around native plant gardens, or conflicts with homeowners associations or municipalities, or even just vague feelings of discomfort that a neighbor might have and you might be navigating in a conversation. So many of these relate to goldenrod and misunderstandings about goldenrod. It's one of the most maligned native plants out there, and yet it's also one of the most ecologically valuable. So, and I actually attribute this, courtesy of my co-author, Sheila Kola, who passed away last year. Sheila introduced me to the idea, or introduced me to what she believes, and I agree with her wholeheartedly, that in Snow White, the look at the plant that is causing Sneezy to sneeze. It is goldenrod. And so goldenrod is a much maligned native plant. This is a garden, a friend of mine who was cited for goldenrods. You can see in the notice violation, and that's me waiting around for the city to appear and cut it down, and I was going to be calling the media the second they showed up. So a lot of misunderstandings about goldenrod, and yet it is one of the most valuable plants for pollen specialist bees. So share that with people. Share that it doesn't cause hay fever. That is, an incorrect idea. Just it's a misconception out there. It doesn't cause hay fever. It's a wonderful native plant. This is a brochure that my friend, the botanist Ryan Godfrey, and I wrote as volunteers. Our city, Toronto, designed the brochure for us and put it on the website. You can download it. Just Google "Get to Know Goldenrod" and Toronto, and it'll lead you to this. You can download it, print it out, share it with people, put it in their mailboxes if randomly. And feel free to revise it actually for your own community. I think another very valuable way to talk about and spread the word about native plants, and that they're the foundation, is to really stress that they're the foundation of food webs. Of course, this is a message that Douglas Ptolemy has had such success with getting the word out there, and people are listening. And it's clearly a very it's a message that has great impact. People understand that creatures need food, we need food. So that's a good thing to talk about with neighbors. And keep in mind that when you're talking with neighbors about your garden, and you're talking, let's say, about biodiversity or something like that, people tend to focus on these big charismatic species, the elephants, the tigers, the lions, not so much on insects. So you're going to be up against that. Or maybe if they're interested in insects, they're interested in monarchs and fireflies, which is great. I mean, they're amazing insects. But to try to help your neighbors and homeowners associations, municipalities understand that, the insects are crucial to food webs, and that biodiversity is protective. That message I mentioned right at the beginning, as a way to talk with neighbors, a very simple idea. Biodiversity is protective, and your garden is supporting biodiversity. One of the ways that I've found really helpful to talk about this is, and the importance of biodiversity, is basically to talk about the image of a spider web. And it's very easy to understand that a spider web is strong because of all those nodes of connection. And the nodes of connection are those co-evolved relationships between native plants and, let's say, specialist insects, for example. And that's what makes that's what makes the web of biodiversity strong, is all those co-evolved relationships. And so we need to support those relationships. And one of the ways we're doing it is through our native plant gardens. And in the context of climate change, when we connect that spider web and the importance of biodiversity with climate change for our neighbors and friends and families and HO and homeowners associations. When we talk about how important biodiversity is to mitigating and adapting to climate change, um, uh, that is another way to approach it. Again, for some people, it might not be the way. Maybe you're dealing with a neighbor or friend, family who isn't motivated by, who actually just wants to hide from the any talk about flooding and heat waves and that kind of thing. Like um, you can take that into account. Um, but for those who might be motivated by seeing this connection with climate change, the biodiversity of native plants gardening is protective. And maybe you can personalize it by, not just money, for example, what these disasters are causing us, but and the way that biodiversity is actually one of the ways the biodiversity, and if everyone was, enhancing biodiversity in their own yards, as Douglas Talamy has taught us, what a huge difference it would make. But it's protective. But personalize it. Do our neighbors miss seeing birds or wildflowers in the wild or whatever? And that native plant gardens and naturalizing it can actually empower you and them, if they want to do it too, with hope and action. And, a lot of people who are worried about everything that's going on, we're all looking for hope and action. One of the sort of personal examples I use that I've found people really respond to, I could talk about biodiversity forever and maybe, friends' eyes glaze over, and I might talk about research like this paper on the bottom right in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, and talk about the death by 1,000 cuts of the global threat to insects. But when I say and when I say, in referring to this seminal study that was done in 2017, when I say, have you noticed fewer bugs on your car windshield? People get that. That's a concrete example. So that's another idea of a way. Make it personal. Talk about the ways that native plant gardens, like rain gardens, for example, they can be solutions to problems. Like maybe your neighbor has an area that's flooding and a rain garden will actually help them. And that's why you have a rain garden, or, an area that's quite wet. Well, conventional gardening tells gardeners that's a problem. Well, you're talking about a solution. Or, in drought, it's happening more because of climate change. The way that native plant gardens are more resilient to these stresses. And this is such a visual example from my friend Miriam's garden, where her boulevard, you can see it in kind of the mid-left there, so resilient during the drought. Her neighbors' health strips or boulevards just, brown and crisping. Well, Miriam's boulevard garden was cut down 3 times by her municipality, until they, but after 3 times, she kept at it. She kept, doing the work and advocating. And now her municipality is actually using her garden as an example of the environmental action that can be done. Another thing, I think talk is actually action. So I think talking with your neighbors is incredibly important. But there's also, like, very simple actions, or maybe, well, I would say it's a simple and fun action that you can take as well with your neighbors. Share your plants and seeds with them. On the lower left is a photo of an event that Pam and I did in our front yard, hosted by World Wildlife Fund and Carolina in Canada. We gave away plants to neighbors, native plants, and neighbors who were the least bit interested in our native plant front yard, no interest in our native plant backyard, for years and years, were very interested in free native plants and planted them in their own yards. So at whatever scale, like there's also an example, I just put some native plants on a chair out front, giving them away, or there's so many creative ways to be able to do this that will bring people in. And I guess, you know, I think one of the main reasons why we're in this position of needing, or like sort of having these conversations with neighbors and potentially conflict, have to admit, with municipalities or homeowners associations, is because native plant gardens are still not the norm. So how do we make them the norm? Obviously, by having them everywhere. Like, how do we make them the norm? That will help. We need to demonstrate native plant gardens in public places. So that is motivation, I think. This idea of relating to friends, families, neighbors, etc., is real motivation to get native plant gardens out there everywhere. I'm just going to end with a what to do if your homeowners association or municipal enforcement come calling. It's really important to be grounded in the rules, know what they are, read them. Find out specifically what rule you're not complying with. Ask for specifics and details. I know someone very recently, she just called, wanted help because her municipality had told her to mow down the native plants on her boulevard, native plants which were under, any height that would cause problems for sight lines or anything like that. Like, she was very careful about that. And I asked her, okay, well, what rule are they saying you're breaking? Well, she asked the municipality, and they didn't actually have a rule about that. So that's caused them to scramble and wonder, whoa, so ask for specifics about and details. Ask what would bring you into compliance. Consider. Oh, and in my friend's example, I actually think that just her asking, what is the rule, has made them realize, okay, there isn't a rule. And actually, we need rules about sight lines, but we don't need to get everyone to cut their boulevards. Maybe we want boulevards. We know that they're of native plant gardens, etc. Anyway, consider what you're willing to do and not willing to do, how you might compromise or not. That's your decision. There's no right or wrong here. Find allies like neighbors who love what you're doing, garden clubs, environment groups. If it's an HOA, you'll need to, and a municipality, you'll need to make your case, explain in as much detail as possible what you're doing, how, what, why of your landscape. You'll need to make diagrams and include plant names to show that you know what you're doing. You're doing it intentionally. It's on purpose. And really, it's so important to address any concerns they've expressed, if possible. And maybe addressing those concerns means saying, hey, you know what? If I have my boulevard garden at, below a certain height, then I'm not going to be obstructing sight lines. Like, acknowledge that sight lines are important to think about, and then address that concern. For broader change, this is more work, but you might want to join your HOA board and work for change from within. You might decide to go to the media with, if you are challenged for your landscape that you're looking after intentionally, of native plants and really caring for. You might you might be up to taking political action to change municipal ordinances or state law. And there have been all kinds of examples of that happening recently. State laws have changed in Illinois, Florida, Maryland. Those are some of the states where um, people working for change have led to the point where those states have rules that are laws around municipalities not being able to limit or control native landscaping for, let's say, biodiversity, for example. Okay, I know I've gone through things very quickly. I just want to end with some resources, many resources out there for both, that kind of collective advocacy work or individual advocacy work. Also for talking with neighbors, guides for talking with neighbors. I worked with Pollinator Partnership, the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, and put together this Pollinator Gardens and Property Standards document, which has advice and links to a load of resources. Some of the resources we link to in that are here as well on the screen, and we'll put it in the chat. And finally, I just want to thank you again for being here and say, please feel free to, I know I've gone through things quickly. We'll have a chance for Q&A. I'm also happy to help out if you're interested in efforts towards broader change of, ordinances or HOA rules. And I'm happy to talk with you. And there's a contact button on my website. So please feel free to reach out. I want to support the work that all of you are doing as part of the Less Lawn, More Life Challenge, the work you're doing as native plant gardeners, as habitat gardeners. I'm full of gratitude for the work you're doing. And if I can be of any help, I'm happy to. So thanks a lot. I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll get to a Q&A.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. That was absolutely fantastic and fascinating and had so many great points. And I want to just quickly nail in two of them. So one is about cues to care, and really appreciate you saying that, because while we are all trying to shift the aesthetic kind of narrative and all of that, we are, at the forefront of this movement, and I feel like it is our responsibility to put our best foot forward. And so actually week 11 of the challenge, which some folks have just gotten and some will get, is all about how to signal intention. Many of the things that you recommended, and actually the Pollinator Partnership resource that you helped build is one of the resources linked in there. But just emphasizing for folks that, these cues to care are important for neighbors. They're also parts of, many of them are parts of what make a landscape feel restorative for humans. So paths that lead you through a landscape, or benches and things to sit on, sculptural focal points. Those are all things that research shows help humans feel restorative in a landscape. So beyond being things that help avoid some of these conversations with neighbors, there are things that are also help you. So I hope that all of you will take those very seriously and think about, even a very small place, what you can do to signal intentionality in your space. So thank you for emphasizing that, Lorraine.
And
The
thank you, Zoe, for making that point so strongly. And it's crucial. And as we know, gardens are actually about intention.
Yes.
That's what distinguishes a garden, right? It's
Yeah.
what we're doing. We're actively doing it. I guess I was hoping to make the point that aesthetics are so variable and subjective. And I'm really, but that research on cues to care
Yeah.
is pretty clear.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point because, a lot of like the native plantings is associated with the naturalistic, kind of these wild spaces that give kind of nod to prairies or untended places. But actually, you can make any style of garden with native plants. You could make like
Yes.
a Parisian, like, Versailles style Charleston garden all out of ilex. So you can make any style of garden with native plants. And for many of us, we love this kind of naturalistic look. I know I have it here. And so, but being aware that, lawns have come out a lot of a colonial history, and it's an American reaction to having open spaces and showing respect for neighbors, right? And so throwing that away is going to take a while. And so whatever we can do to facilitate that, particularly as kind of the evangelists at the front end of this movement, is really important. And so we should take our role seriously. I think another
Yes.
point you made, which is about, communicating the value of what you're doing in terms of the food web, and particularly in terms of specialist insects, which I think are starting to rise a bit in the conversation of people understanding that there is like one plant that this insect can feed off of, otherwise it's going to die, is really important. And that said, many of us get into this not like expecting or wanting to be educators and not having necessarily the breadth of knowledge you have. And so I'm going to make a small plug for the app Wilder Places, because in that you can go in and you can add all of the native plants that you have in your yard. And as you do that, it starts adding up all of the wildlife species that you can support, at least as it comes to Lepidoptera, so moths and butterflies, and then specialist bees. So as you're having these conversations with the neighbors, if you're using your app, you could say, well, I have 91 species of native plants, and they support, like my yard, over 1,700 species of wildlife. And, 100 of those are specialist bees that otherwise have nothing to eat. And so there are some shortcuts now that we're hoping to support you with, so that you don't necessarily have to have the breadth of knowledge that Lorraine does, but you can still rely on some facts and data. So I think that's, that's something I just wanted to throw out there for folks as a new tool that maybe they could leverage.
That's an
Um,
amazing resource, an amazing resource. Congratulations and thank you. Thank you for doing that. It
well, some
changed.
of our early conversations, Lorraine, about specialist insects and your work on them and leading me to the right places for the data has helped get to this. So it's an example of all of this coming together. So thank you. I think I want to dive into we'll start with some of like kind of the easier ones and then get into the nitty-gritty of like what happens when you're, actually maybe in conflict. So if you're just talking with a neighbor and they're kind of curious about it but not quite sold on it, what's the first conversation you have? Or you kind of mentioned that, folks is the reasons that they might have hesitation differ. So what are some questions that you might ask that help understand what somebody's fears or myths or concerns are that you could just then like break down? What are some shortcut questions that you go to?
Well, actually, one of the first things I do actually, and that I've seen other people do is, and that works, is actually to reassure your neighbor that you're not going to be insulted. You're not gonna be and this takes work. Does it ever take personal work? To not be insulted, to not be defensive, to not, try to educate them like, "I'm right, you're wrong, I have all the information and you're doing something wrong." But rather to be really to reassure, and to actually be open and generous and non-judgmental in the conversation, and to let them know that because it's hard. These can be very hard conversations. It depends, of course, on having good relationships with your neighbors, and not everyone does. I mean, of course, all of us here on this whole webinar, we're so reasonable. But neighbor conflict is about all kinds of things. And one of the things I've actually observed over the decades of doing this work is that often the conflict around the landscape is actually a proxy for a different conflict that the neighbors are actually having. So neighbors are, whatever, fighting about something else, noise, I don't know, whatever, or they just don't like each other. And there's this tool, which is a vague municipal ordinance, like an HOA rule that one neighbor might use to actually go after you because of your garden and landscape and the way that you're gardening. So that's what I meant by it being a kind of proxy. So that's what so acknowledging that, I you know, that these are hard conversations, that not everybody has a great relationship with your neighbor. There's conflict all over the place. But to try to go into these conversations with as much openness, generosity as you can possibly muster, and let them know that you honestly want to understand and that you are going to make every effort to address their concerns. Their concerns, and then and talk about it. So though I don't I hope
Yeah,
that's
no,
helpful.
that's really helpful, and I think, one of the pieces that you said there, I think is really critical, something I struggle with, which is, like, I don't know if you use this word specifically, but not being preachy. So, like, it's hard in this moment. We're like, we're doing the good work, but like not being preachy and asking questions because a lot of it is about mutual respect, right? And knowing that somebody who mows their lawn every day, part of that, can come from different things, their meditation or whatever, but like part of it is showing off that they respect their neighbors. And so in these conversations, I think what you're saying is showing that respect, even if, it's hard for you, do that personal work to show up because it's for the good of the movement.
Yeah,
Um,
and
I
yeah.
go ahead.
Sorry about that. Don't, the kind of don't be preachy. I've heard a lot of folks say, "Well, I wanna educate my neighbor." Do you like being educated by someone else? I mean, and all of, as you said, Zoe, we're often put into the position of being educators, but oh my goodness, don't call your, don't position this as you educating someone. That's a terrible, it can be received as condescending, as not respectful, all that stuff. Share some information, share your passion.
I think that piece, like what I've found, in my neighborhood where there's a lot of lawns, I'm definitely a standout on the block, but I have neighbors starting to add natives in, is just sharing my enthusiasm. So they'll like walk by and I'll be out there, dirty, and they're like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Oh, I just planted this cool plant and it supports XYZ." Or like, "I just saw like 1 million fireflies tonight. So I'm making sure my lights are off." Right. And so sharing that from an eye, like the I feel language applies to native plants too, I think. Um, Okay. So next question, which is, well, I guess like my example of my yard just kind of standing out, but have you ever seen a one garden set off like a domino effect on the block where other people start doing it? And do you have a sense for what the conditions are that help that happen or stop it?
An amazing question. I have seen it over and over and over again. Even like just in the place where I live, this community, it used to be very rare to see a front yard garden, period. Like whether native plant or, just a flower garden, or let's say a food garden. So I do a lot of work around urban agriculture as well and food growing. And it, because as we all know, it, goes so perfectly with native plant gardening, supporting pollinators who are supporting the food production, who are feeding, and on and on. Um, and I think one thing that leads to the conditions of is when you're doing it, to actually um be quite present in doing it, like be out there all the time, casually, even like just be out there talking to people, talking with neighbors, sharing plants, um putting up a sign, um like I think that's one of the conditions for spreading the movement. And what I've observed, here where I live is, going from almost no front yard gardens ever to now it being incredibly common. Oh, most people have front yard gardens, and a lot of people have front yard native plant gardens. Some people have front yard food gardens, and uh, it's it's often just takes the one person doing it in the neighborhood, in the block, to kind of give permission, and when they're doing it in a very public and present way, um, and sharing plants and sharing information, saying, "Hey, can I help?" And maybe even tweaking, being, going out, let's say, gardening on the like taking it a step further, gardening on the boulevard, the health strip, that's a big step. And then maybe asking a neighbor, "Hey, are you tired of mowing your boulevard? I have so many plants. Can I garden your boulevard?" Let's say it's an elderly neighbor who you can help out by, and that's one of the ways to spread too. I'm all for these kind of community. I really think the value is in and the opportunity is in working collectively and really trying to bring neighbors on board by being a resource. If you're just even one step ahead is
Yeah.
enough to bring on
One thing
people.
I've thought about doing is getting one of those, like, little free libraries and putting some extra seeds from my garden and also maybe some of the books in there. So it's like, here it is if you want it. Now, question on the working together. So some problems really can only get solved when neighbors come together. So like bamboo or an invasive or a common area with invasives that you want to manage or something like that. How do you start those conversations and keep them productive? Or another example, which I guess is related, is if like a neighbor starts clearing mature trees or an area of great habitat, how can you approach those difficult conversations?
Yes. Oh, the trees, that's a particularly interesting one and heartbreaking one. And I think it's a very good example of the way that we can do all this work, and what what we also need to really work at, or somehow, whether it's us each one of us individually or whatever, policy changes at a broader level. We need tree protection bylaws
Mhm.
and ordinances and laws. And I know that, you know, that takes a lot of work. We can try to convince, 100 friends to keep their trees, and they can all be lost if without that kind of policy context. So that's a particular heartbreaking, but also encouraging example, because again, where I live in this region, as I mentioned, I'm in the Toronto area, so Southern Ontario, Great Lakes. There's been such a movement over the last couple of decades to have tree protection bylaws. Okay, so I zeroed in on trees. I know your question was bigger than that, and it had to do, yeah.
I think it's about, yeah, collective action. But I think the point about policy is really the critical piece in it because it does take time, right? And so for folks who are in areas that don't necessarily have policy to support them, you might start the conversation now. So some of those resources that Lorraine shared, like the Pollinator Partnership one, Wild Ones has some resources, a lot of other folks. You might start, like, for example, 2 years ago, I started emailing my mayor saying, could we have some pro native plant policies? Last year, or actually just a couple months ago, there's a new town board member who's interested in this and asked me for some of the resources that I had mentioned to the mayor. So it's conversations that can take a while. Plant the seed now, maybe send an email with some example ordinances and just know it could take a while. And then, if those things I think are happening on a neighbor's property, be familiar with what the legal statutes are. And also, like, don't maybe don't fall into a totally I don't know how you would feel about this, Lorraine, but, like, don't, like, ruin a neighbor relationship over that one thing when it's part of a bigger systemic problem, and you can have a positive and productive conversation if it starts, like, really falling down a hole. Maybe you're approaching it from a different way. Maybe you get incited to go and, like, talk to the town about implementing townwide laws. So, I don't know.
Yeah. Really important point. I think the other thing too about this kind of policy type action, and your example of emailing the mayor and then it kind of leading to other great things, so inspiring. Um, each one of us will have a kind of, I don't know, the thing that grabs us, or we might not be into, I don't know, advocating for policy change around tree protection or whatever, but we might see an opportunity, I don't know, for something like native plant swaps in our community. And our policy action on that could be to reach out. We might really just like talking with people. And so maybe but not politicians. So we reach out to a community group and say, hey, have you thought about, in a community environment group or whatever? Hey, I'd love to help out with a plant swap or something like that. I don't know. Like this collective work, you can do it in the way that follows your passion.
Yes,
Again, like, I guess it's sort of a message of everything I've been talking about. There's no right way, wrong way. It's very much, there's not an only way, I guess. There probably are some wrong ways. I didn't get into them. But there's no one right way. There are lots of
absolutely.
possibilities.
I love that. Okay, well, keeping, awareness of people's time, just to end saying, for folks who have received an ordinance or are struggling to navigate maybe a very strict HOA, what would you tell people who either, have a really strict HOA that they can't do things or have been told to get rid of what they've done or have actually received a citation? What's their next step to deal with that? Because I know all of those are hyper personal, and you gave some really good overviews, but like for the person who's really struggling right now, what can they hear?
If you've received a notice, let's say, I would suggest, and I know this is hard, the very first thing is really try to stay as calm as possible. I know that it's really hard emotionally to be told that, you have to remove it, or whatever, cut down or take out certain plants or whatever of this incredible work that you're doing and that you love. So really try to center yourself. I think that's super important because this can take a toll. I've seen it over and over again. So that's one thing to do. Another thing to do is really try to find support from friends and other people in your community. That is going to really help you with it in terms of like emotionally, but also practically. So try to find those people, whether they're, in local environment groups, nature groups, gardening groups, wild ones chapters. So find that support. The other thing is, I think it is very, very important to really know the rules. And you mentioned HOA in particular, A's in particular. So know the rules. Um, find out exactly what the problem is and what they're asking you to do. Get this clear, get it in writing. That's the other thing. Some advice. I mean, I did go through, some steps and some things, but get it in writing. That's, so there's so much emotion attached to this. You want to be clear. And one thing I didn't mention, kind of this is very escalated. So this is not where you start. No, necessarily. You might be someone who's decided to start there. Again, there's no one way. Um, hiring a lawyer to write a letter. For example, where I am, again, I know it's different, this context here, in Toronto, in Canada. I work a lot. Like I do this work as volunteer, but I often help people who end up hiring. There are a couple of lawyers here one lawyer in particular who specializes in these ordinance and bylaw and HOA stuff and has a kind of template letter that sometimes just sending out that letter will do it. Other times it won't. So that's kind of very escalated. But the first things I've mentioned are places where I would start. And document what you did. Keep lists. Write down, do diagrams. Where did you buy the plants? How much did you spend on the plants? How many thousands of plants have you propagated yourself? All of this. How did you design your garden? all of that. Document this. Don't worry at all about inundating your HOA with documentation and the things you want to say. Say them all.
Love it. That's perfect. Well, thank you, Lorraine. I know we'll get questions in the chat and comments, and this will spark a lot of conversation. You have been incredible. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your experience. I'll make one last plug for the Wilder app. It is a place that you can document what native plants you have in your yard. And then again, if you have feature ideas, particularly some of those great ones that Lorraine mentioned at the end about documentation, let us know. And we are trying to build this by and for this community because we want this to go mainstream. We want these conversations to be a thing of the past. But at the bottom line, I think good neighbors make good neighbors. And so investing in those relationships with your neighbors, whether it's native plants or knowing who has a generator on the block is really valuable, especially these days. And so go out there and maybe, I don't know, I don't make cookies. I bring some plants over, but do whatever you can to get to know the people in your area because local community really, really matters. And as much as we can do to foster good relationships there, I think that allyship is really important. And that's one of the things I heard from the many nuggets of wisdom that Lorraine shared today. So thank you, everyone. And if you're not already signed up, lesslawnmorelife.com or joinwilder.com. Please, we hope to see you in the challenge and in the app.
Thank you.